Jiva Korja. Hi, everybody. Good evening to you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another Fireside Chat, and this is our 58th one. So, hi, Sherry from New York, Julia from London, Lisa from Washington, Stephanie from snowy Utah. No snow here yet. Tara from New York. Wonderful to see you. And snowy upstate New York also. So, and so Hannah from soggy South Wales, and Ava from Belgium, and Francis from Finland. Oh, I don't know what the weather's like there, but you're all very welcome. And Poland, lovely. Devon, that's great. And Sydney, well done getting up so early to watch it. And Oklahoma, the south of France, bonsoir. Hello. And hi, Adi from New Zealand, and John from Slough. Ciao, Elvira from Italy. Wonderful to see you all. Great. So let me introduce you to my guest. We're going to the US, actually. We're going to New England, aren't we?
Yes, so New Hampshire.
Blake Octavian Blair. So you're very, very welcome, Blake.
Well, hello. Yeah, we're in New England. It's New Hampshire. And we're slightly snowy here. We got about a half an inch last night. So it dusted everything, and it was just enough to have to shovel a path to the mailbox. So, not too arduous, and light and fluffy.
Brilliant, brilliant. So what's New England like?
Interestingly, I've lived so many places, and New England has been my favorite. So the part of New England that I'm in is in southern New Hampshire, and I live in the Merrimack Valley. So that's sort of the start of a valley into the foothills that work their way towards the White Mountains. You go through a series of valleys and work your way up. And we're actually the most tree-covered state in the United States. So it makes me very happy being a Druid and all. So, and I also live just up the hill from the Merrimack River. So we're probably 10 blocks from the Merrimack River. And between me and the river is a great big, lovely municipal cemetery that's wooded. So it's a lovely, lovely place. And we're pretty cold this time of year for a lot of people. They go, oh, brr, it's about 30 degrees Fahrenheit right now. And I don't know what that is in Celsius because I'm terrible at the conversion. Yeah, I don't know. All my in-laws are Canadian, and they all do Celsius, and they're not good at translating to Fahrenheit. So we'll call each other on the phones and be looking up each other's temperatures all at the same time.
Well, maybe some of our viewers can let us know.
Right, exactly. But so it's a very wooded state, and even though I live in a city, I live in Manchester, we still have tons and tons of tree cover. If you saw an aerial shot, the only place that you would not notice tree cover all over is probably downtown. And you would still see the trees in between the taller buildings. So it's quite nice that way. Yeah, I'm quite happy about it. So, we're right next door to Vermont. And if you didn't know the subtle changes or see a sign, you just kind of pass right through and the landscape stays real similar. So yeah, it doesn't really start to change until you go south into Massachusetts, and the eastern half of the state is Boston.
Yeah.
And then there's Western Massachusetts. So people are like, what do you mean the whole eastern half of the state? We lived in Boston for 3 years before New Hampshire. So Boston and its surrounding metro literally it feels like the eastern half of the state. It's probably the eastern third. So that's why the joke that everybody in New England's nodding their heads and going, yes, the eastern half of the state is Boston. So
it's -2.
-2 Celsius.
Yeah.
Okay. Makes it sound even more wintry,
It is. It's 2 degrees below freezing.
But I don't know. It's not too bad here. I go outside. This is, what I wear down to about 30 degrees. So like I can go outside shoveling everything in this. But this is a colorwork hand knit sweater that my husband made me. We both knit and spin.
Oh, do you?
He also weaves and does natural dyeing. But yeah, so it's incredibly warm. So I have just long sleeve t-shirt on under this, and I can go out and do all sorts in just this. A lot of people will think I'm crazy, but no, that's a New Englander, and we'll still do it while drinking iced coffee. So, yes.
Well, there are a number of comments, admiration for your sweater. So,
oh, well, thank you so much. I'm sure that my husband will appreciate that too. So, yeah.
So, did he produce the dyes for this?
No, this is actually hand dyed by a hand dyer in the region here.
Wow.
And he knit it and didn't dye this. He actually just got into doing natural dyeing while we were in OVA grade. So the past couple of years, yeah. So, but yeah, it's very, very comfortable, very, very warm. So
that's beautiful. And Robert Jones says hi from another weaver. Yeah.
Well, hello there. So yeah, I look at the loom and get confused. He does. My husband does the weaving, and it's just its own form of magic. And I like to spin a lot, so I have spinning wheels outnumber people in this house. So there's, I believe, 5 spinning wheels right now in the house. Yeah, 3 of them are mine, and we've got a 6th, I believe, coming into the house soon. So we are inheriting, my favorite type of inheriting without death. So a friend of ours is giving us a spinning wheel that she's had custody of that's from 1780 something. It was built by a Revolutionary War veteran named Hugh Ramsey here in the state of New Hampshire. And so it's quite a neat thing. He made, I don't know, a few dozen wheels to my knowledge, and it's part of our state history. And so we'll be taking on that wheel into the herd of spinning wheels in the house. So,
well, it's interesting. It's a house of 2 married spinsters.
Yes. I guess that's the way to go with that, right?
Well, that's the origin of the spinster, was the woman who didn't get married. Her role was to spin the wool for the family.
Yeah.
And that was but that meant she dedicated her life to do that. And actually, there's a number. Kristen says she has 7 antiques. There's a number of people who are either missing their looms or loving it. And Adrian and JJ say hi. They just asked me to say hi.
Hello.
So it's just wonderful, the interest. So, I mean, I've spun with a herd of spinning wheels. Thanks, Chrissy.
Yes.
With what do you call it? With the spindle, just the hand spindle.
Yeah, we know how to do that, and I've done that, and I learned on that. I recommend you start with a drop spindle.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, and you do learn, and especially how to draft. You learn real well with that. And then they tell you to move to the wheel. Now, I found that the two weren't really analogous. They were completely different things to me, So then I learned again on the wheel. And it's wonderfully cool to use the drop spindle. It's its own enchanting thing and very meditative.
Yeah.
But it's not good for production. Like, I'm not going to make a sweater's worth of yarn on a drop spindle. That's what the wheels are for. Yeah. And there's different wheels for different purposes too. Like we actually have in the house what's called the Canadian production wheel, which the actual wheel part is very large. And there's vocabulary, 2 types of spinning wheels. There's many, but 2 popular types are a Casa wheel and a Saxony wheel. The Saxony wheel is what people think of in fairy tales. You see fairy tales, and it's the big wheel out to the side. And then a Casa wheel is where it's all stacked, or the wheel's right in front of you, and the bobbin and the orifice are right on top of it. We have both kinds in the house, because when you have a herd of spinning wheels, that's what happens. But a Canadian production wheel is a Saxony, and they were popularized in Canada. And the wheel itself has a really huge diameter. And it gives you a ratio to the diameter that's on the orifice and the bobbin that you set on the flyer, which is the part that holds the bobbin. And that ratio allows you to spin a lot thin and fast.
I get that.
Yeah.
Clive from Chiroan in Northern Ireland. Wow, that's just beautiful to have that. Very personal gift. and the heart intentions is so very sacred when woven into the garment, very healing. Often the elder matriarch would craft the garments for ceremony, births, and death rites. Lovely.
Yeah, the spinning wheels are just a great way to enter a meditative state, really, because you can get really focused on it. And it's funny because you also get to a point where you can do it, hold a conversation, and do other things while you're doing it, right?
Going
But
off.
you can also go into a meditative state doing it. And, you know, the whole spin a spell thing, it's true. It's true.
Oh, it's wonderful. I know when I've used the drop one, I come out with lumpy wool, but I don't have the the temperament or the patience just to keep going.
That's
So
what we call art yarn. There's a word for that. When it's all nuppy, it has little slugs and the noops in it. Yeah. Yeah. You call that art yarn. It has character.
I like that.
Yeah. And it's great for weaving with. Like the thick and thin textured yarn is good for weaving with. So yeah.
Well, I've never spun enough to make anything, but I just liked what I learned. We went, Howard, my husband and I went on a workshop and somebody had them, and we just made them. Just got around just a disc of wood and a dowel and put it in, and then we had our spindles, and I just got such a kick out of using them. So occasionally when I'm doing some archaeology in my house, I find it.
Right.
And then I say, oh, that's where that is. And then I must remember that. And then I forget again. Till the next.
Take the little bits that are not enough to knit or weave with, and you use them to do little knot magic or to tie up little spell bags or
okay.
There's uses for that. There's uses for that. Yeah. No waste.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
So Ava says, for me, spinning is the best way to ground myself. When I'm feeling really out of sorts, nothing better to cure than that. Half an hour of spinning. Very interesting.
It's very true. Lowers your anxiety and everything else. I mean, I'm a Capricorn that's prone to anxiety. So, you know, the spinning wheels are great for that, you know. Really tamps it down. Yeah. But it's great to hear so many people know what I'm talking about with the spinning. I'm delighted, you know.
So you spin the wool, and then what happens to it? You give it to Wayne and he knits, or
I knit it. I mean, we both knit. I mean, it happens both directions. And what's really interesting is there's a thing with spinners and knitters where we do both, but actually knitting with your hand spun, like it ends up being like, I have all this hand spun, I've got stacks of it. I've made maybe 2 projects with my own hand spun. It's kind of interesting that way because you're also interested in everybody else's. And so a lot of times, like for exchanges, like you'll spin yarn and then give it to somebody else, and then they'll make or give you their yarn. Because there's something interesting about knitting up somebody else's, right? I don't know. It's a less depressing version of the cobbler's children have no shoes. So it's, you know, stuff I've made out of my own, I don't have a lot of. But I'm also not a super fast knitter.
Yeah.
And I'm decent at speed. But Gawain could smoke me. My husband's name is Gawain, for those that don't know. He could smoke me on speed with knitting. I mean, he can make a sweater in a month.
Yeah.
You know, at the speed of a few hours a night. I don't even like to knit sweaters. I like to do shawls or cowls and things like that. And I'll take my time. And if I'm diligent, I can make a shawl in a couple of months. You know, so he's knit plenty with hand spun. I've knit very little with hand spun. But I like to say I'm taking my time. I don't like to rush it. So, you know, but it's not a race. You know, that's the thing with anything like that. It's like you should do these things to make you happy and to get the other benefits from it. You know, if you enjoy knitting and it lowers your anxiety and all these wonderful things, you can meditate while doing it. And it takes you a week, 3 weeks, or 3 months. It's not the timeline. It's a process. So
yeah, rather than the object, the journey rather than the destination. Very, very lovely.
Exactly.
Salve, yes, archaeology. It's domestic archaeology. It's when when things get buried, then you need to go digging with little teaspoons and little trowels to find things. And I have found some interesting things when I've done it. So anyway, I'm going to say no more. All right.
I think we all experience it with books, though.
Yeah.
At least Druids do, right? We have the piles everywhere of books. And when you want to find that one book, you haven't looked at it in 6 months and it's somewhere, but you end up on a library excavation,
Exactly. So Shanda, I drop spindle also, knit, weave, and crochet. I love its connection to the earth.
Yeah, and what's really cool is I've actually seen the process of, we have a friend who's a sheep farmer. And she lives about 2 hours from here on the border of Vermont and New Hampshire, on the New Hampshire side. And we are good friends, and we go out, and we've been there on shearing day. And we sit and visit in the sheep pen. We set our lawn chairs out, and we knit in the sheep pen with the sheep around us, because they're actually incredibly sweet. And they're like woolly dogs. Like, they each have personalities, and they'll come up and we'll pet them, and they all have their quirks. And we have garments that we've made in the house that we know the sheep. The sheep was sheared. We got the wool. We sent it out to get processed, made the product, etc. So, you're connected to that whole process where the sheep lives in New England it came from, and here's the finished item. So it's really enchanting in its own kind of way,
David says, get some alpaca fleece. I did. I was in Peru in 2009, and I still have it, but the idea I was going to spin that as well with my drop.
And alpaca is so
warm.
And alpaca is so warm.
It's so soft.
If you blend it with like sheep's wool, it's a great combination.
Okay.
But if you have a high alpaca content, you can sweat yourself out. Like, it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
Beautiful. I have a friend, Pamela Curry, who's a weaver and a spinner. And I remember she gathering the fleece as it was shorn, washing it in these big, big crates. I mean, dedicatedly washing it, carding it, spinning it, and then weaving it. And I have one of her woven blankets.
It's wonderful.
But a long, dedicated process,
Oh, yeah.
So beautiful.
It takes time, but patience, patience is a many splendid thing. And I've learned a lot over time, especially since beginning to practice Druidry. Like, patience is, people are like, oh, what have you learned from Druidry? Be like, patience, it's and I joke begrudgingly, but like, it's a process, because especially if you're a person that ever is prone to anxiety and patience are at odds with each other.
Yes.
Right. But I've also learned that, over the years, most things do work out in the end, some way, somehow. And the worst case scenario rarely comes to pass. You may not get the best case scenario. That can be as equally as rare. But the worst case scenario rarely comes to pass. So, but yes.
AD, this means nothing to me, but I will pass on the question to AD, who's in New Zealand, and he was a guest some months back. Are you for Pandy, Skuld, or Orper, or a bit of all three? These are the spinning norns. Does it make any sense to you?
I regret to say that I don't know those terms either, AD. I know.
Enlighten us, AD.
It could be an American vocabulary breakdown. Lost in translation.
And I'm lost too. Anyway, so when you're so where are you from originally?
Nowhere. I'm glad you asked that question. No, the truth is, I was born in the state of New Mexico, in the desert during a snowstorm. And before I was a year old, we moved to Alaska. I had an Air Force father. So here we go. 4 years in Alaska, in Anchorage. And then to the state of Virginia for 4 years. So from Alaska back over to the East Coast to Virginia. And then he exited the military, and we moved to Iowa. Now that was between when I was in the 2nd grade going into the 3rd grade. So from there, I was in Iowa for 10 years until I finished high school. So if I'm really pushed, I will say I'm from the state of Iowa, right on the Mississippi River, where Iowa and Illinois meet. And that was a pivotal time, because if you think about 3rd grade all the way until I was 18. So I would say that I'm from there.
Mhm.
And a lot of people will say that, well, you don't really, I always thought this was an odd phrase. I think everybody has an accent. But in the States, people will say to me, oh, you don't have an accent. Because then they'll say, other people that know linguistics or voices, will go, well, you have a Midwestern radio voice. Which I guess that means it's without, say, some of the nuance of the Southern accents or the very strong, what's considered the Bostonian accent, which is really not as much a thing in Boston anymore, because so many people from everywhere. It's more towards the North Shore, which all the New Englanders are going, yeah, that's a North Shore thing. It's the North Shore. But and it was bizarre that we ended up in New England because, well, from Iowa, I ended up in Florida. So I was there for 8 years. Went to university there, University of Florida, go Gators. And I met Gwen in Florida while we were going to the University of Florida. Not because we both went to the university. He was in the engineering department and I was in the English and religion department with a student body of 60,000 students or more. So we met at a bookstore at a meeting of the local pagan community gathering. So we met there. And from there, we went to the state of North Carolina. So now we're working up the East Coast.
Wow.
Yeah, we ended up there because he was going to graduate school there. So off we both went. And then we ended up in Boston for work, and now New Hampshire. And it was intriguing, like I was starting to say, that we ended up in New England and in Boston, because my mother is from Lynn, Massachusetts, which is right by Boston, but she left before I was born. And so I'd only ever visited a couple times to see relatives. And then we ended up moving to Boston. So it was very surreal to be around these landmarks and in the area where my mother had grown up, and I'd heard these stories. And then for her to then have me telling her stories of me living in this place.
Mhm.
So it was really interesting when she would come to visit that way. And to go through these places. And because she had some interesting times she wouldn't mind me sharing in Boston, because while she grew up there, she went in the military because she was essentially homeless. She was living on a bench basically in the Boston Common.
Okay.
And the military provides food, shelter, clothing. And it seemed a really good option. So she went in the military. And so it's interesting, we talk about the energy of a place and spirits of place and things. For me to go through Boston, and on 4 days out of 5 of the week, I would walk through the Boston Common. So it was an interesting place. And it didn't have really, despite that fact, it was not a negative connotation. Mm-hmm. But, it's always interesting. And one of my first OBOD friends in the area in Boston works with the homeless. So he's actually been on the program, Christian Brunner. So
yeah.
His day job is he does a lot to help the homeless in various capacities. So it's an interesting connection, how everything loops around in life. All these little tendrils come together in interesting ways. So it's
interesting. Yeah. It just struck me, walking through Boston Common, but it's a testimony to your mother's resilience and her ability to survive and be resourceful Okay, the military wouldn't be my thing because
Mine neither.
the control is too much for me. However, needs must, and she survived it, and to such a way was successful in that her son then can walk through Boston Common, who
Yeah.
doesn't have to sleep on a bench, you know.
And all those things simultaneously were running through my mind, especially since homeless are very visible in Boston. There's a definite problem. And this will be all these years later. I mean, she left into the Air Force, I believe, in 1979. I was born in 1984.
Okay.
And we moved to Boston in 2015. So, it's the fact that, this is an issue that is still, of course, through history, it's always been existent, but it's still prevalent. And, it's nice to know that there are people constantly working on things, as I mentioned, and people in our ranks, which always, it's great to know so many different people, which, I mean, the diversity of people in the order is always a thing to me. It's always amazing. And we often, so many of us find our ways into helping professions. And it's just an affirmation of like, oh, I found a spiritual home. But yeah, and she got through it. And, there I was to go through Boston Common. And, she'd come back and visit, and still, one of the places she wanted to go was Boston Common because it has a good energy. It's a lovely place when you sit and talk to spirits of place. So it's the term homeless is kind of a misnomer, because another friend of mine that works with the homeless that I met while I was living in North Carolina,
Mhm.
the term is more or less unhoused is a much better term, because these people will tell you, especially that are from someplace, I have a home. This place, this city, this area is my home. I am from here. I live here. I'm not homeless.
Yes.
They're unhoused. And I think that that's a much more dignified term too. And I'll find myself correcting myself because we're so ingrained with that term, and it's not actually true.
Hmm.
And the more that I study, my Druid path, and you interact with spirits of place in different places, all of that makes sense too. Because even though I'm lucky enough to be housed, this is the first place that like truly felt like I belong here. Like I am a part of this land and not living just on top of the land.
Uh-huh.
One of many spirits here among all the spirits that are here. Other places just felt like I was visiting. Even if I'm welcome,
Yeah.
it just feels like visiting. And also, there's a lot of factors to that. And I think that it's interesting because one level is it's in some ways an ancestral home. In
Mhm.
that several generations back, as I had researched family tree and relatives I'd never even heard of, right? Um, my mother's side of the family was always, well, Sicilian Italian, or was the general thing, and they're very Bostonian Italian. However, as I researched it, they're just as much English as they are Italian, because it would have been my great grandmother was the one who came over from England, and I found the ship manifest that had her name on it. Which, when I found that, like the hair on the back of my neck stood up. This is someone I had never known, had never met. And then traced it back even further. But it just, the tingle all over when I saw that document, handwritten, back then with her name on it. And, some of the print and stamp worn off, barely legible. And it was just something to behold. And so I arrived here in 2015, not knowing any of that. and not knowing how long had anybody in my family lived in New England. I knew my mother was from here, and clearly my grandparents were. Right, that was it. But it went back to then, and on the my mother's father's side, it went back slightly farther. But so we'd been here a while, and I, as the fates would have it, as I don't believe in coincidence, ended up here, and it feels like home. The landscape feels like home as well. I've always thought before I moved to Boston that I would be a city person, and that wasn't so much the case for me. I thought it would be great to be in the city and ecological. I could do mostly public transport and things like that. And the city was good for the 3 years we lived there, but it just wasn't long term. That the population density was too much for me, very intense, and not close enough to the green space. So Manchester, New Hampshire, that we live now, is a city. And I hesitate because the population is 110,000, which there's people who are going to chime in, why live someplace it's much smaller? And yeah, but coming from Boston, it's far smaller, from millions to 110,000. And New Hampshire has a character to it, even though Manchester's the largest city in the state. Like I mentioned, I'm blocks from woods.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. And the wooded cemetery that's just down the hill is wonderful because it's as much trees as it is, gravesite. So it was wonderful, especially those that have been through ovate grade. Like that was my ovate's playground. You have ancestors of the land right there, and the nature spirits are there. And we have, I like to say, made friends with. We like to go visit. There's a pair of red-tailed hawks that live in the cemetery, and their range surrounds our neighborhood. So we'll see them, and often then see them looping their way back to their nest at the cemetery. Or we'll be walking through and we'll see them. I'm like, oh, look, there they are. It's like our friends because we're so used to seeing them. We've seen red foxes in the cemetery. There are wild turkeys.
Oh,
yeah.
These are the bronze ones. These are bronze turkeys?
I don't actually know the particular variety, but wild turkey, we've got them all through New Hampshire.
What color are they? Are they
brown?
Brown. Okay.
Yeah. And so the turkeys, and we have ducks and geese. The Canadian geese migrate in and out, and we give the geese their wide berth. They get a little testy. I had never met an angry goose till this last summer.
What did you do?
I'd love to know. But and they'd always left me alone, and I never got particularly close to them. But there was this one, I got within about 30 feet of it, and I was just walking past, and it had things to say. It started coming up at me, and I was like, whoa, and I backed off. But I was like, I thought that might have well been my end. I don't know what the epitaph would have been about that, but I thought that goose was going to take me down. So,
Somebody says here, Canadian geese, also known as the Canadian cobra chicken.
Right?
Cindy says you looked at one and they know.
Yes. There are overlords of the north, Canadian geese.
We suggest it might have had goslings nearby.
Maybe. I mean, it's always possible. I didn't see them, but it's possible. This cemetery, when they come in, there's like multiple separate flocks. There's got to be over 100 of them at various points. Like there's no place to get away from them. They're just everywhere. So you just try and give them their space. Do not go directly towards the goose. It's like, do not look directly into the sun. Do not go directly towards the goose.
There's a comment from Ricky, Goosegate.
Oh god,
Hashtag.
hilarious. Yes, yes. Oh, I'm gonna have to start using that.
Well, David says a Canada goose can knock a man off a horse and break his arm.
Yes.
And I was going to say this, but Philippa, you've beaten me to it. Well, not my great aunt, but my great aunt had geese as guards instead of dogs. And I know of people who've had geese for security instead of dogs.
Sometimes they'll actually use them for security for flocks of sheep.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Protect wolves.
Yeah, guard geese. That's a well-known thing. They usually have guard animals for the flock. And our friend had llamas. She had guard llamas. And I was always afraid of llamas because a lot of people are like, oh, that they bite or they spit. And I've learned not really. They're just like a lot of creatures where they're very individual. But it's this misnomer. They can actually be quite sweet. And, I was introduced, I was very afraid, but I'm like, no. And go closely. And like when you meet a lot of animals, you put your hand out flat, let them smell you and work up closely. Don't go up in their blind spot. A lot of people just go up to the animal and in their blind spot. Humans don't take well to that level.
You don't like that either. Yeah.
Right. So, and then made real good friends with these llamas. They were real super sweet. So,
Well, David says dogs make inferior watch geese.
It's potentially true. I mean, there's various breeds that are used. Great Pyrenees are common for guard dogs for sheep.
Yeah.
I've met a Great Pyrenees, but never one who was a guard dog for sheep. So I can't attest to that.
Yeah. That's wonderful. My great grandmother, born in 1900, always said the best watchdog is goose. So, I mean, you're getting a lot of, and then James Wood, he says, Ihim goose, gay actually is the Irish for goose. G.E. father, G with an accent, Gok Yule, he eats goose every Christmas or every Yule. So that's lovely.
James, he keeps trying to teach me some Irish.
Oh, does he?
It's always over like text message, and he has to send me a link with the pronunciation. And it's always like I always kind of like want to use a little bit, but then I'm like, if I try to use a little bit, I will just butcher it, just terribly.
Well, you can unbutcher it once you start butchering it. And he says, Goramagat, Falsharot, James. Thank you very much. So, and somebody says, Siduri9 says, Canadians are famous for being affable. I've always believed it was because all the pent up rage from living above us states.
My Canadian relatives over, say, the previous 4 years would often say, we're looking down at you, wanting to know what's going on. But enough of that, But yes, my but my Canadian relatives often, it's when it would get really sticky, those 4 years, I would just tell people I'm Canadian because I'm married to one. So it doesn't exactly work like that, but so. But,
we have an explanation here. Thanks, Keith. And this is, I assume, is empirical. Canada geese are just angry that they have to leave Canada in the winter.
I'll side with that. Canada's beautiful, and I've been, as a child when we drove from Alaska to move to Virginia.
Yeah,
we went through Canada, and we went through Banff, which was just beautiful. Banff, it's a big national park area out west. It's a beautiful area. But the best I can tell you is after Google it and look at the pictures, because that's what we do with everything nowadays, right? I'll just Google it and there will be images. And we were passing through, and it was my mother, my father, myself, and our miniature schnauzer, Becky. And it was a snowstorm hit. And we were going through this, Rocky Mountains territory and going through Banff, and snow comes. You've got to, you stop. You can't continue.
Okay.
And we pull into this hotel, little mom and pop hotel. And there's very little space available. And, I'm super, super young. And the people, the innkeepers for a term, they found a spot for us, and they started to make food for us, and they got stuff for the dog, and like personally took care of us.
Lovely.
And it was just, such wonderful hospitality. And I find people go, well, it's not true across the board about Canadians, but I have found it to be true. Like in my own experience, I'll say 95% of Canadians are like that. I mean, I might be partially obligated because half my family is Canadian. No, I'm just kidding. No, they really are wonderful people. I found the hospitality. So
Wonderful. So you met Gwen in Florida.
I did.
At a pagan event. So what brought you into the order, into Druidry?
So we were interested in Druidry all the way back then. But being poor undergraduate students, like a lot of things, back then, I don't even remember what the order's website was like, because, we're looking at, we met in 2006. And, we didn't have a lot of financial resources. And on that, we didn't know which of the different Druid organizations to make heads or tails of. And so it kind of would get shelved. There were a few books, and we read some, but we were practicing pagans, but it was just kind of like a specific tradition, not as much at that point. And then we ended up next in North Carolina, like I mentioned. And while we were there, we started training extensively with the Foundation for Shamanic Studies.
Okay.
And so did all kinds of advanced training with them over the 5 years that we were there, gradually through time. And it was wonderful. It very much resonated. And we still practice that tradition to this day. And we ended up in Boston, as mentioned, and found the Cambridge Shamanic Circle, which practices ceremony and has shamanic circles in the tradition as the foundation teaches. And while we were there, we'd gone for a few months, and the ceremonies are held mostly in dark. So the lights are off. We met at a Quaker meeting house right next to Harvard campus, which wonderful people. I love Quakers, and the similarities, the Venn diagram of shamanism, Quakerism, and Druidry, there's actually so much common territory. So most of the ceremony is done in dark by candlelight. And a different member will take turns leading, being ceremonial leader. And a member had come back after being gone for a month, had some family business and vacation out of the country from where they were from, because they weren't originally from the States, and led ceremony, and it was really good. And you can resonate, different ceremonial leaders, you resonate with different people's style, and we're like, it was really comfortable. And so we started talking afterwards, and he introduced himself, and it was Christian Brunner, and he had just come back from seeing his family in Austria. And so we were visiting, etc. And then after a few more months afterwards, he's like, well, why don't you come to the pub with me and another friend of ours, and we'll get some drinks. And we're like, well, we took the train, and the trains will stop at 11. And if we're out after that, it's a long walk home, And he's like, I'll give you a ride. Throw the drums in the back. And so off we go. And a few more months of that. And got to be good friends. And, he's got a Gandalf quality of the fact that, a wizard is never early or never late, but always arrives just when he's needed or when he means to. So connecting where our apartment was in Boston was right near something called the Minuteman Walkway Bikeway that connected all the way down to the subway station. it was a 1 mile walk for us between the apartment and the subway station. And it was uncanny the number of times that our timing just happened to sync up. And he would zip past on his bicycle and stop and get off the bike and walk and talk with us. And when we had moved to Boston and really had very few friends, like hardly knew anybody, he was a very friendly presence and really took the time and really cared how we were doing and things like that. And it came out over time that he was an OBOD, and that sunk in, and back from being interested in all the Druid orders. And it's like, okay, well, now we actually know somebody in one of them, and had interacted cursorily with people from different orders at like pagan pride events at various places. But now we knew an OBOD, and he would talk little bits about it, and theology seemed to overlap with the shamanic tradition we were in, a lot of shared territory. And so we ended up joining the order because it's like he would have certain ways of approaching things and situations, and it really had a good impression. And we're like, well, as far as we've seen from all the Druid groups, like we like what we see as far as what a person that belongs to it. Because let's face it, people represent their organizations, whether they mean to or not, right? And we liked what we saw, and so in we went. And he'll either say, "Don't blame me," or I'll say, "Well, blame him." But I don't know, somehow. So now we're in the order, and we joined in 2017, and it's been a lovely, steady journey. And just got Gwen and I both word over the past couple weeks from our mentors that our Druid grade invitation packets are in the mail. So, I mean, it's been quite a process, and it's time to head for the next part of that process. And it's quite exciting, but, and the caring of the order members to each other is always just, the community was a huge draw of it. Because you don't just get an entry into Druidry and all the wonderful education that is the course, right? You get this family that comes along with it. And we joined the order, and we told Christian, and he's like, "Oh, well, I'll have to invite you to the Grove and have initiations at the Grove." And so we did start going to the Grove, and Lunasad 2017 was our first ritual. And it was just kind of an immediate sort of thing, and fit right in with the Grove family, and they made us feel welcome. And Druid hospitality is a real thing, let me tell you.
Yes.
And it was shortly after we joined, my grandmother-in-law passed away. And she was a wonderful, good Celt, that's what I'll say. She was originally Scottish and had moved to Canada with our grandfather, who we called Papa, and he was English, so they were a house divided, Scottish and English. There was all kinds of little bits and bobbles over the year about that. And part of that caring is when Grandma passed away, we had messaged Christian when she was still ill in the hospital, because he was one of our closest friends in the area, and we had come from shared traditions. We're newly into OBOD, and we had all the exact same shamanic training. We had done ours in the States and in North Carolina. He had done his with the European faculty over in Europe. So there was a common understanding. He goes, "Okay." And he dropped everything. And, we told him in the evening, like 8 or so at night. And he goes, "Tomorrow morning, meet me at 10 a.m. at this location in this forest at one of the conservation lands." And we did. And he did healing ceremony with us for Grandma, because the thing is even when you, like, we know how to have a healing ceremony, and we have ways to do things, but we all need each other because you can, some things you're just not in a place to do it for yourself.
Right.
Mhm. And he was right there, and rearranged his schedule and showed up, and it was grand. So and she did end up passing away, and to me, healing worked all the same, because healing isn't always what we want, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's what would have to happen. And so after a short period in the hospital, on she went, and concertedly, sort of, she was a very active, inspirational person. And a lot of times, like, I feel like I dedicate some of my Druid learnings to her, because while she was discernibly no particular spirituality, she knew what she was doing, and she had her little things, but she worked magic in all those little folk ways that it's just what you do, right? And she always had a knowing, to where, like, she wouldn't say much, but we'd talk about doing something, and she'd have that look in her eye, like she understands what's going on. But Papa was kind of like an avowed scientific atheist. So it was kind of like, she wouldn't want to say much, because, Papa would be like, what? No. But she's like, I know. And so, she was a real good presence, and always made me feel welcome too, because when I first met her, she came to Florida in a very thinly veiled trip to Florida.
Okay.
To meet me, right? So they had this excuse to go to Florida, because a lot of my husband's brother and father live in South Florida. They're like, oh, well, we'll swing down and see them, and then on the way back we'll see you. And it was all, it appeared, a very thinly veiled disguise to meet this new partner, who, for the first few months of our relationship, I was Gawain's friend. Now, and it wasn't for any lack of acceptance. They've always been completely on board, well before they knew me. And our uncle, when Gawain and his brother would go up to Canada, to Toronto, to visit, they would take them as kids to Toronto Gay Pride. So, I mean, very, very open. But for some reason, once it was their grandson's partner, there was like this moment, and then a light switch, though. Like, all of a sudden, like, month 3 came around, and it was partner. It was. So to me, like, people were like, did that upset you for that? And I'm like, really? No, it was just kind of cute that, like, all of a sudden, then it was partner. And when they came to meet me, by that point, it was already partner, and they were fine. And we met them at the hotel. And so, because they were staying in a hotel, we had no room in our apartment, So I get out of the car, and I stand up out of the car. And before I know it, there's a 5'2" Scottish woman with her arms around me. And she says, "You must be Blake." And from that moment on, in their words, I was their grandchild.
Oh, beautiful.
So yeah, and it was wonderful. And she and Papa have both passed now, but they were actually, out of all my grandparents, I joke, but it's true, they were my most present and best set of grandparents I had, due to a lot of circumstances. I was never close with my father's side of the family. And my mother's parents, her father passed away when she was 22 or 3.
Okay.
And she wasn't close to her mother for various reasons. And so we hadn't visited her much. So my grandparents-in-law were my grandparents, and were absolutely fabulous. And funny in so many ways they probably didn't intend, but just little idiosyncrasies, you know,
That's
like
beautiful.
my like Papa trying to make me instant coffee. Just no, no. No, and apparently, like that was always the thing that they would have in the house because they were more tea drinkers, I guess. And so when company would want coffee, he's like, "Well, let's get instant. I can make you coffee," and I'd be like, "Oh, okay." And our uncle, his name is Martin. Uncle Martin would be like, mouthing no to me across the room, and I'd be like, and then he would usually save me, and we'd go off to a coffee shop because Papa was trying to push instant coffee. Yeah, it's those little things we remember.
Wonderful details.
Yeah.
Gabriella says, grandmothers know everything. We think we are really clever for learning stuff they have known for ages.
That is true. That was definitely grandma.
Can't argue with that. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you have a daily practice?
Yeah, and it varies I always say it varies from day to day. And I always think it's important to share that it's not as if it happens every day.
Yeah.
It happens 4 to 5 days out of 7. And a lot of people are always like, they feel horrible because they don't do 365 days of it doesn't happen every day. And if you miss a day, you just do it the next day. Getting back on the horse is everything. I mean, that's the triumph. I mean, and as long as you do that, fine. And I do every day. I do the Druid's prayer.
Yeah.
And I do peace to the directions. And that's the minimum, the baseline minimum. Because even if you're having a difficult time or a hard day or it's jam-packed or something, that's manageable.
Yeah.
And the longer version of that is, I do the Druid's prayer and peace to the directions and some other exercises I learned through my studies. And I always try to call upon my power animals from my shamanic tradition and bring them close to me and some other things. And I call it long form and short form. The long version, the long form, 20, 25 minutes of various practices. Short form, could be 3 minutes or less. And that's another thing that helps me actually maintain having a daily practice is it's not all or nothing. I designed it for myself so it can meet me where I'm at. And I think that, that's something I learned from the course. At various points in the course, it's very good about, helping you figure out where you're at and what works for you, and that things are not all or nothing. And, when it gives instructions how to do something, it's you can do this, or this, in this way or in this way. And it was permission to like, okay, all these people say they do this daily practice and they have something, and it must really be something to maintain. Let me tell you, I'm not a perfect person. I'm not infallible. It can be done because it's what does it look like? We hear other people, but you never see what it looks like in practice. And it doesn't have to be complicated. And I've made sure to not make it complicated. That way it's obtainable.
I think simplicity is very much key. I know when I was doing my journey through the course, that was the wonderful thing, is that if this is right for you, if this feels right for you, do it now. And that, Deborah says the best practice is as light as a feather. I think so. And we don't talk about piety, pious truths, that it's what works for you. And I think the single smallest thing you can do allows you to be.
Yeah.
And to be through it. And then, like you say, you could have a 3-minute practice or a 1 minute, and then you and then you can have a longer practice when it feels right for you.
Yeah. And I mean, the same thing like extends, whether it's your personal daily practice or a big group ritual, right? That you don't, it doesn't have to be complicated to be effective. In that, like 2 notes is that I was talking about this at one point when I was in Bardic grade with a Grove mate, and her name is Kat. And Kat was like, well, my daily practice at a minimum is, peace of the directions in the Druid's prayer. And then there's other stuff if I want to do other stuff. And it was like a light bulb shone on me. Because a lot of times, here's the thing, everybody's experienced this, right? We have the knowledge. We know that. But it doesn't dawn on us until somebody says it to us, right? And I was like, oh, it can be that easy. And so that was the start of my mind. And then other things in the Guers helped reaffirm. And group rituals, I started going to the Grove. I had seen other pagan traditions, group rituals. And, you need a full luggage set to haul all the equipment out, right? We've got to have the chalice and the athame and the wand and a candle for each quarter and incense and this and that and it's daunting. Mystic River Grove, my grove, go to ritual, and it's what you need. That's the supply list. As is, for those in the course know, like when you actually look at a supply list for a ritual, it may seem like a lot, but then when you stop and you read it the second time and gather everything, it's not that much. It's a handful of things at most. And the Grove would be like, we'd march out into the middle of the woods because we like to do everything outside. And that's, people who know Mystic River Grove, that's a staunch thing. Rituals are always outside. One of my favorite rituals we've ever done was an Imbolg where we hiked 15, 20 minutes into the woods. And then down an embankment next to a frozen lake or pond, and everything was covered in snow. So, thank goodness our Grove mother knew where the pond started and the ground stopped, And we were on top of 6 inches, 8 inches of snow. It was 23 degrees Fahrenheit. And I had on, not uncommon for a winter Mystic River ritual, long underwear, a sweater, couple pairs of socks, the outer one wool. A lot of people had crampons, little ice cleats. An overshirt, a flannel shirt, a sweater, wool coat, wool hat, mittens, and a scarf. And it was a beautiful ritual. And we had it out of snow. Put a little cloth on top of the snow, and then the few ritual items. A lot of rituals, there's not even a cloth. We got in the middle of the woods and you find a good stump or a good rock, because a beautiful thing in our landscape is we have a lot of exposed glacial rock, right? Especially in New Hampshire, we're called the granite state, and it's not for nothing, let me tell you.
Okay.
And there are places where the granite could only be a couple feet below the dirt, from the surface. And I've seen trees with tree limbs growing out right over the rock, So, and that's the altar. There's a good rock, and we set the few things down, the 2 or 3 items, a candle, the chalice, the mead bottle, a corkscrew, essentials,
Yeah, you got your priorities right.
And have ritual. And sometimes that's the entire supply list, save for maybe some smudging material. And it's as good as any, because everything you need is there, And simplicity. I mean, that's the thing. Though there was one ritual. It was a spring equinox, which in New England means we're probably still buried in snow. And we're on one such snowy place in the forest. On one such rock, we have the altar. And before we went to ritual, I had said to our Grove mother, Sarah, I messaged her because, we're all on Facebook Messenger these days. That's all the pre-conversation planning. And I said, hey, do you want me to bring a corkscrew? People often forget that. I'll bring a corkscrew. No, we'll be fine. We'll have like 4 of them. It's good. Just bring yourselves. Okay. So we get there. What's the one thing nobody has? And I look over at Grove Mother, and she's got this chuckle persnickety laugh. They're going to look at me because she knows I had reiterated this exact point. And so we have 4 druids around a rock with this bottle of mead, all game planning how we're going to get this open. Oh, we're going to wrap somebody's cloak around it and bang it on and knock out the cork. Another person is, we're going to take the ritual sword and just hack the top off. And as all these possibly ambulance summoning ideas are being passed, which where we're at, it would take any type of medic 20 minutes to get to us. Let's be smart about this. Somebody's helping spirit somewhere. Somebody across the circle says, somebody that I think it was their first ritual. I don't even know if they were in the order yet. They were just interested and they had come. Had a Swiss Army knife with a corkscrew on it. And saved us. But yes, so everybody, if you do have a ritual planning list, the permanent item on there, 2 things. Something that makes fire. I'm not picky. Some people are like, you can't use a lighter, you have to use matches. I don't care. If it makes fire, we're good. Especially if somebody else forgot, I'll take whatever makes a flame. And then a corkscrew. If you've got a bottle to open, just always have them in there. Buy an extra corkscrew. Just keep it in the ritual bag. Words of wisdom. Or you may find yourself trying to plot who's going to take the ritual sword and open the mead. And I don't suggest anyone try that at home.
Oh, that's just wonderful. So I take it that hasn't been the most challenging thing that you've overcome. So what has been the most challenging thing in your life that you've overcome?
Wow. Most challenging thing. It's hard to pick one, but I would say at various points in life, living authentically, being your authentic self, because I have lived at different times in different places where it wasn't safe to do so.
Okay.
So Iowa, where I grew up, at the time was what I like to call like very apathetically neutrally moderate. So like they're if they did not like, for example, that you were gay, they may not say anything to you in person, but they sure would in a voting booth. And the same was true when I lived in the South, like in North Carolina. But so in Iowa, that would be why I didn't come out till I was 19 and I lived in Florida. Now, the delightful part of that, there's always a humorous part to anything, even if it's kind of a dark humor, which is that, so I moved to Florida and I come out because we moved to Gainesville, Florida, home of University of Florida, which is often called Gaysville, Florida.
Okay.
It's very liberal. And I come out and everything is grand. Luckily, all my coming out stories are happy ones. And I call important people back home. My buddies from high school that were the handful of people I hung out with. My favorite teacher in high school who, had that I was, interestingly, in high school, I was not picked on or anything. I wasn't super popular, like the jock popular. I was known, though, and I can come back to that. But I wasn't picked on either. I had a good experience. But it was still Iowa where, like, I didn't feel like coming out. It wasn't where, bloom where you're planted, they say, and I wasn't sure I could there.
Yeah.
So I came out in Florida, and I called back all these people. And the person who was like my big brother or my godfather type of figure, I called him. Every last one of these people. Well, thank you for telling us, Blake, but we knew.
Oh, you.
We all knew, right? So yeah, so that's the funny thing is, I was worried about it. I want to call and be authentic to these people that are important. And they're like, oh, well, we're glad you all knew. And I had a person who was a roommate of mine at one point. Because another odd, interesting fact of me is I've done professional clowning.
Oh.
So I've been to 3 different clown colleges, and I was boss clown of a tour through Norway. And so when people are conjuring this clown vision in their head, it's less Ronald McDonald, Bozo, more Cirque du Soleil, Charlie Chaplin.
Okay.
Yeah. And this roommate of mine was at one of my clown colleges. And I called him up and I said, well, here's the deal. I wanted to tell you. He goes, well, Blake, I have to ask you a few things. I said, okay. Is this a Monday, Wednesday, Friday thing? A Tuesday, Thursday thing? On the weekends? And then before I could say anything, he cut me off and he's like, are you kidding me? I knew, and I don't care. Like, yeah. But it was funny, and I responded with him. I said, "Yeah," and probably a few words I'm not going to share right now, but yeah, So it was all good, and and as he said to me, he goes, He goes, and the thing is I wouldn't have you any other way. If you had turned out to be some other thing, I would have been like a little worried because I just knew, it's like, again, though, with being authentic, he's like, all of them, a lot of people were like, well, you have to do things when you're comfortable. And that's anything in life, really, so, but yeah, I think those are some of the funnier stories of that,
You're talking about trying to be your authentic self, which you were, you just didn't name it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Because I never denied anything.
But those people, also in touch with their own authentic selves, could recognize it in you and accept you as you are. And I think if we are our real selves, it's much easier for us to accept people when they're real too.
Yeah. And it's like when we moved to Florida, in this very accepting town, and I started college. I had some friends that I made at college who were then like, well, let's go to the gay bar. Have you ever been? I'm like, no. And so we go, and I meet some friends, and we're talking. And because I had been a performer, they had introduced me to friends of theirs that were drag queens.
Okay.
And so, I learned a very wide middle section to a Venn diagram between clowning and being a drag queen, right? Not all drag queens are comedy queens, but they're all hilarious. Like, if they're not comedy queens on stage, which many are, they're just funny off stage, which I find if you're any kind of not mainstream, you develop this sense of humor. Humor diffuses a lot of things, and Lady Pearl was the matriarch of like the whole queer community there and was a drag queen. And she was just hilarious, but she was also very eloquent. And like, even through like all my comedy training, she directly taught me something I learned from other teachers, but she had the best direct way to say it, which was, they'll go out there and make fun of lots of different people in the audience. and themselves and other things and situations, and it's all good fun. And when they pick on you, you know it's just good fun. But it's the key to that is you always make fun of yourself first. You go for yourself first. And so she would, and all the jokes about staying at Motel 6s on the road, like bad hotel jokes are always a thing. And she would but she'd work into very eloquent points, especially at times like where there'd be gay pride shows. She made a whole big speech one year about the right to be able to adopt children, because we lived in Florida, and Florida's having all issues about that.
Okay.
And she had this whole thing where she would start in and she'd be like, I may not be able to make milk to feed my children, but I can go buy some milk. Even though I'm a homosexual, I can take good care of children, but I don't like to necessarily. Homosexual is an awkward term. It makes me think of homo, like homogenized, like a gallon of milk, and I'm just not a gallon of milk, but ooh, that makes me hungry. Anybody got any cookies? She'd be going, on and on and on. But she's just, jokes about how, and in the queer community, everybody has to stick together.
Yes.
And she'd make jokes about her lesbian bodyguard, because, there are stereotypes. And, as much as I understand the issues with stereotypes, a lot of them started with some nugget of truth. And I have had a lot of lesbian friends that were the type that would very much be a protector type. And she would, go out in the audience, talk about her lesbian bodyguard. And she'd be like, I love all people. She goes, I don't care if you're straight, gay, or from the Church of Lesbiterian. All the Lesbiterians scream, and all the lesbians would scream. And she'd get this whole Southern Church of Lesbiterian joke line going, because if we can't laugh at ourselves, you can't, So it's been a time. But the drag queens are another community that is just, it doesn't matter who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're very, very protective. And that while I was in college, I actually lived at home in the same apartment with my mother. We were best friends, and it worked out fine, and certainly saved an awful lot of money on housing, but it worked out because we were like roommates. But she still has her mother, Jean. And so we'd be headed out, and I had 3 circles of friends. I had the pagan community, and I had the drag queens, and the graduate students from the religion department. Because even though I was an undergrad, I had made friends with all the graduate students. And so I'd be headed out to go see friends. And when I'd head out with the religion students from the university, she'd be like, well, be careful, and if you all drink, call somebody to drive, and don't get in any trouble, and if all these concern points. When I'd be headed out, I'm going to go out with, Lady Pearl and my friend Bunny and the drag queens. Okay, have a good time. Because she trusted the drag queens the most out of all of them, that I would be okay. And there was only a few stories where things sounded like they might go sideways. And every time a drag queen would, take off a high heel shoe and just threaten the bejesus out of somebody, and everything's done all right. Nobody wants to, you got a 6'6" drag queen with a 9-inch stiletto heel coming at you. You're just not gonna, it's all good. It's all good. And druids are the same way, in that we all take care of each other. We look out for each other. And I found it doesn't really matter what type of walk of life you come from. We're open to having you. And so, that's my parallel, is that drag queens and druids are pretty similar. And sometimes they're one and the same, right?
That's wonderful. So have you been a drag queen, or are you a drag, or are you, is clowning your thing, or did you kind of
So I'm
move into?
actually a drag queen, though I've had like a lot of honorary drag mothers, as they would say. I have done drag for comedy's sake,
Uh-huh.
in non-drag settings, which is always interesting, like part of other shows. So I wouldn't say I'm a drag queen and that I'm very versed at it, but I have done it a few times, always on a comedy end, and clowning was mostly my thing. And I got out of it, not fully, like you never fully get out of it, but I don't do stuff in makeup much anymore. And that was kind of when I moved to Florida, I realized to make a living doing it, I would have to travel 40 plus weeks a year. And I'm not actually a nomad at heart, but that's what it would take to make an income level to support oneself.
Okay.
Because it's really hard. There are other ways to do it, not travel. It happens. But the most common, easy way to do it is to travel, and a lot. And that wasn't what I wanted to do. Combined with a few things. I was, coming out at that time too, out of the closet. And what's interesting is the touring, theatrical, and circus type communities, they don't care who you are. And there's not as deep of misconceptions about people. The local entertainer markets were populated by demographics that really frowned upon or looked down upon you if you were GLBT, which was sad, you know. But so I kind of shifted gears, and I went to school, and then when I graduated, for a period of time, I taught in Florida before we left for North Carolina. I taught public school and did substitute teaching. And I was lucky to have a lot of long-term sub gigs, which is where it's like more than one day. You do 2, 3, 5 weeks in one room. And that was interesting because the vibe was very much, at the time, not a lot of teachers were out to students,
Uh-huh.
but other faculty knew. So, and I had a good teaching mentor who, I'd be very, because I was trying to navigate what the climate was, right? You don't know, so you're feeling things up. So I'd be in the teacher's lounge and I'd be talking about my partner, my spouse, my partner, my spouse. Because my whole thing is I never lied, but I'd be careful with my words.
Yeah.
Is enough for people that will clue in, people that won't. And I always had my ring on. And so, she would notice. And then one day, after me being in there for like the third week, she's like, "It's okay, Mr. Blair. You can let your rainbow shine. We know." And she was like 65 or 70 and very sassy. And at the time, I'm in my mid-20s. And so very maternal figure. And so there was that point I just knew, when I had some students, it started to give me some trouble. Because here's the thing, never underestimate kids, right? I never try to pull wool over any kid's eyes. So a few of them had figured it out, but were clearly kind of like from a background that was not teaching them the same diversity acceptance that a lot of us would. And so they started to quiz me, well, you have what's your wife's name? I bet you don't have a wife. I'm getting there. And so my student teacher saw this and took them outside at lunch. And all I know is after lunch, there was never a problem after that. So, what wonderfully, great student teacher, but she had them all year and she knew how to deal with the individuals. I'm still a substitute, even though I was in that room for 5 weeks. This was the third week. when you're the substitute, there's only certain level of
That's
thing you'll do, And so, she took care of it, and that was fine. She came back in, and on one of our breaks in the lounge, she was like, yeah, I knew, and this was probably going to happen. I saw it arriving, and she goes, I just took care of it, So,
That's wonderful.
yeah.
There's some other question. Gabriella says, this is what she said, but drag queens, this is going back a little bit, drag queens are sassier than druids, so they get extra points in sassiness.
Well, drag queens, especially if you're seeing them in a show environment, it's all bets are off.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of them are every bit as kind and sweet, I think, as most druids are. But once you hit that show floor, the claws come out. It's that whole thing.
And she said, I believe we all end up in life where we're meant to arrive and be. Yet it is disheartening to listen to the stories of humans not being fully loving of each other. Absolutely, Gabriella. That is so true. I just lovely to hear. It's heartening to hear yours, Blake, of the allies you've had. Like that student teacher spotting something, dealing with it, diffusing it, just allowing, a little bit of education, or a little, however she handled it. That letting kids see another way, or have another way of looking at it, and it's lovely to hear of those people that have minded you and supported you and see you as you are.
And those were fifth graders at the time. And
how old is that?
Huh?
What's fifth grade in the US?
Oh goodness. Okay, so we start in kindergarten and then have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 12 grades.
Okay, so 5 is
it's your 6th year of school.
So you're about 10, 11, 12?
About that. I'm always poor at that math, but
you start 4, 6, 10, 11, 12. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so it wasn't till, like I started teaching like high school. I had some high school gigs. The high schoolers, they all know.
Yeah.
They know. And you don't even have to say anything, they know. Because, I'm not the most masculine person, not the most feminine person, but I'm a sassy person. And so, like, I have bits.
Is it drag or druid, the sassiness?
The thing is, I talk with my hands a lot, and so I'm constantly out of frame. but also, people ask me, well, is that because of your Italian relatives? Because they all are very. I'm like, well, maybe. I'm like, there's 3 factors. There's the fact that I was a performer, and I think that we're just a little large. There is the family Italian factor, and I'm gay. So, I'm very, very with the gestures. And so I teach, and, I'm just me. And they figure it out.
Yeah.
And it was great, though, because at that age, you've got students who are figuring themselves out. And maybe I'm somebody that represents them. And I'd have a few come up to me, and they would like start doing the hinting. And I can't give an example because it depends on the dialogue, but I would say something back that kind of says, yeah, we have that in common. And it would be a thing. And they'd be reading something, and I would comment on it and then suggest something else to read that was in line, and it was fine. But by that age, and I think that we're having generational turnover too, and it gives me great hope. And that, let's face it, anytime I say stuff about this, I get people from other generations that are before mine. They get upset because they think that I'm saying negative things about them. And they're like, well, I'm not like that. And it's like, well, that's true, but there are sweeping traits through generations for good or for ill. And I'm seeing some of the traits of earlier generations that made things rather difficult for me and parts of who I am kind of not being carried over into future generations, and future generations being more open-minded about certain things. And not only being open-minded, but open about it. Because, I know lots of people in generations before mine who are perfectly open-minded, and they have said this to me, but they didn't always feel comfortable being open about that. So as things are slowly changing and the generations churn over, I'm what they call a millennial, and people pick on millennials, but I'm proud to be one. Oh, I know. I like my avocado toast. But anyway, yeah. But the younger generations are having less of a problem with certain things, and they're being vocal about it. So I think we're working through some various things. And it's to the point now where I have friends who are still school teachers that are much older than me and from other generations, who are now themselves able to be out to their students, even at young ages where the students are younger in elementary or middle school. And it's just not a thing, not as bad of a thing. Now, it depends where you are geographically, because culture can vary sometimes. But yeah, it's improving, and I'm glad for it. And I'm super glad for the people in generations before me that were vocal and things like that. It's, I've learned a few things over time, which is, I had bad experiences, for example, living in the southern United States. And there's a lot of stereotypes involving that region. And I unfortunately experienced a number of them. However, I had friends that are from there, born and raised, who are nothing like that. And a particular friend of mine that I met in North Carolina, he's actually a very liberal Mennonite minister. And he was originally from Mississippi, and he ended up in North Carolina, worked with the homeless, and now he's back in Mississippi as work takes him. But he would often say things not even directly to me, but just in his writings or his teachings, or when he would talk in groups, because he would do a lot of interfaith work and things too, about the fact that you can't lump everybody together. It's not fair.
Yeah.
And he's like, when people say things about, well, all people from the South or the South, and then something negative, he's like, if I feel like it's me, even though I know I'm an exception. And it's made me stop and sort of think, because I will hesitate before making some huge blanket statement, because then there's, my friend Hugh. So it's like, okay, well, everybody says this, but and there's more people just like him. And I had lots of those people as friends. So, he'll be the first to say it's not that those things aren't true, but they're never going to not be true if we keep saying that this is how everything is, because he knows that there are those problems, and he's helping work to change it. I mean, he's been a GLBT ally. He's an ally for people who are unhoused and other marginalized demographics. And, so it's kind of important to remember. So whenever I've had an experience where something bad has happened to me, I try and look for the good too,
Yeah.
And so, I could not wait to move out of the South. And I'm still glad I live where I live. But I am better at looking back to see the positive parts, and that not, the good people and things like that. Not everything was terrible. And, there are cultural things from that region that are not negative, So it's, dealing with your own shadows to look back and sort of stop and see where you might have been wrong, or I look back at the, 22, 23-year-old me, now that I'm 37, who very much would have a lot to say about things and be pretty loud about it. And probably people who are like, well, it's not that bad. And well, I don't think that, I don't want to hear it. It's all, but everybody else, and guilt by association. And I am much more careful about not doing that. So.
Yeah, Stephanie says, I can't wait to see how Jen, well, I'd say Z, you say Z, changes the world. They're fierce, independent, and ready to defend justice and equality.
Yeah.
I think there have always been fierce, independent people ready to defend justice and equality in every generation.
I agree, but yeah, and I totally agree. But what I think that they're getting at is kind of what I'm mentioning, that there's always been those fierce, independent people who are fighting for that. But now we're seeing like it's a dominant trait in the entire generation. You know, like before we had sections of the population, even if they were large, they were still sort of a smaller fraction of the larger generation. And now we're seeing that fraction of the generation be sort of a majority of these generations. At least that's what, you know, I'm observing here in the States. I mean, I do hear from people in other countries, it's varying degrees of things, you know. I have a limited perspective because of where I live, but
yeah, because I remember, you know, well, I was growing up in the 70s, but hearing about the 60s and how everybody went out and protested, etc., etc. And then into the 80s, people become very, very conservative. And then it comes out. And I think you get these waves of, but I'm also aware of how, even though there's a lot of discrimination, but in terms of discourse, there's a greater openness because everything is on the table now, whether you agree with it or whether people discriminate against certain peoples, but at least it's out there. That's people are talking about whether they agree with it or not, but there is that space to have conversations where before so many people had to remain hidden.
Yeah. It's like elders in my grove will talk about the protests they've gone to. Like Christian has told stories of going out to protests in his old Volkswagen bug he had, which I just like the vision, you know. And yes, Christian, I like the vision of you and your Volkswagen bug headed to a protest when you were younger than I am now, probably.
Yeah.
And or like, you know, I remember our grove mother saying at one point, I don't remember what the issue was, whether it was a queer rights thing, an environmental thing, a women's rights thing. It could be any of them. But she made the statement about, I protested this crap in the 60s. Why the hell do I still have to protest that crap now? You know, and I don't know. It's inspirational. I'm glad. And, you know, it's like, but the thing is, it's like, I love those people like her because she'll still go out and fight that crap now. You know, and tell all her badge of honor stories of, you know, the time she got arrested doing it, or, you know, you know, which I can share the story that happened because she put it on Facebook and I was like, really? And she's like, you bet I did, you know. I love her for it, you know.
That's wonderful. So speaking of protests, and she got arrested, what's the most reckless thing you've done?
You know, and I pause because like I'm making a list, right?
Which one?
Well, no, because it's always like they don't seem traditionally reckless. But like when we moved to Boston, okay, here's one. We'll probably get a few because I'm loquacious. But what can I say? So we were going to move wherever my husband got a job because I write from home. So I can do my job anywhere. His is more specific. So it's wherever they ended up moving him for that, we were going to go. And there are various places. So the company that hired him finally settled on an office that would be good to put his skill set in. And so it was Boston. So we were going to move to Boston. A future / new coworker of his at that time, since he just started, emailed him. And this was March, I want to say. and we were going to move in May.
Mhm.
And said, okay, the thing about Boston is the apartments run on a broker system. It's like a real estate agent for apartments. So every place else we had lived, you would go tour apartments, and the company that owns it would have an office on site and people work in the office that you would deal with and show you apartments and rent the apartments, or a landlord that directly owns it. Here in this region and in Boston, they have basically brokers, which are like real estate agents for apartments. So the people that own apartments hire them, and they take your list of criteria, find ones that fit it, and take you around and show you all these apartments. And the turnaround on renting an apartment at that time, we called up, and she's like, okay, well, I have 9 or 10 things that could fit. Can you be here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.? And we're like, no, we are a 14 to 16 hour drive away. We can be there on Friday. Today's Wednesday, and Friday is when we said we could be there, not Thursday. I'm like, okay, well, the likelihood of anything on this list still being available is like no, because things rent in half a day. So we ended up calling up friends of friends who we hadn't met before, local friends that had friends in Boston that we hadn't met. We ended up messaging them, and they said, yeah, okay, we've never met you, but you know our friends, and we've been friends online for a little while. Sure, we'll make up the guest room. You can come stay with us while you look for an apartment. So we immediately got in the car and drove the 14, 16 hours up the East Coast and met the broker, looked at apartments, signed on an apartment. And yeah, so I mean, it was this kind of this whirlwind thing. Didn't know where we were going to live or how. I had no idea what it was like in the city, because living in the city in Boston was a whole different world than anywhere else that either of us had really lived. It's like a whole new universe.
Mm-hmm.
And people that have lived, say, very suburban or small town or a college town and in a big city will kind of know the comparison I'm thinking of, because we went from like, you drive a car everywhere, theology, you don't know if people are conservative or not, and just the way everything operates and the amount of space you have, the distance to your neighbor, everything's different. So now we're on public transportation, and we're living in a mid-rise apartment building, and it's mostly a liberal city where if you don't have an open-minded theology about different people, you're the minority.
Mhm.
So, if anybody says anything, other people got something to say about it, that you're speaking bad about somebody. So that part was nice. And it was just a whole change. So, I mean, reckless, I guess, would be like them saying, well, if you want, we have a position in Boston, and us going, yeah, let's move to Boston. And all within 36 hours, not really knowing where we're going, to having signed a lease on an apartment, staying with people that had never met us before but were so kind, who these same people then said, when are you moving in? And we said, this date in May. They took vacation days from work to help us move in and unload our moving van.
Wow.
Which is a blessing too, because having a moving van in downtown Boston, like I've never been to London or to like a big city. Like I've never been to Ireland either, but big city there. Like imagine driving a giant box truck through downtown.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. But hey, all is well, right? Now we own our first house. Now we're in New Hampshire. So, and we had the Grove do our house blessing.
Lovely.
And Christian was the head officiant ritualist for that. And so our neighbors got a good show because they got 30 druids in dress.
Oh, lovely.
And we did it. We did it right, girl. We did the whole thing. We did the inside with the outside around the house. Part of the ceremony is we planted an apple tree in the backyard.
Beautiful.
Before the ceremony, we had dug the hole and got everything ready. Had the tree there. And then part of the ceremony was we put it in. But we also circumambulated the house 9 times. And everybody carried incense, and we had a cauldron that was smoking too.
Beautiful.
And Christian was in his Austrian Alpine best, lederhosen, everything, plumed hat, which is awesome. Like, I live for it, right? It's awesome. He was serving Alpine realness. And I don't know what the neighbors saw. We didn't care. We were doing our thing, right? But here come the bells and the smoke and the druids going around the house. And I wouldn't have had it any other way,
Beautiful. It's lovely to have that, the community to support you in.
Yeah.
So moving into your own home, the one that you own is that's a really big thing. There was a question somebody asked earlier. How did you get into your writing? How did you move from clowning to writing?
So when I was in university, my life was writing, right? And I had a friend who wrote for Llewellyn Worldwide, which is the publisher I write for.
Okay.
And he said, I had him proofreading for me a lot of my university papers. You always need another set of eyes. I've looked at it for how long? Somebody else, please.
Yeah.
And I had a minor in religions of Asia, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Shintoism. And he knew a lot about this. So he was a good proofreader. And he said to me, you have a lot to say. You say it in an interesting way. And it's quite readable. He goes, so if you took it and made it slightly less an academic form and more a popular form, what do you think? And I said, well, I'll think about it. And then I got an email that was carbon copied on, that he was carbon copied on, from one of his editors that said, send me sample writing. He had went and said, my friend can probably, and then so apparently I didn't act fast enough for him. So, then the editor emailed and I sent in samples and I got my first contract. And they liked what I did. And so the next year it was a little bit more. And now it's been over a decade and that's what I've been doing. So it just happened. I'd like to, a lot of people with various things will say to my husband or myself about some various accomplishment or thing. Well, how did you get to this?
Yeah.
And it's the work is part of it. Sure. I don't want the answer, hard work. Well, partially, but also things just kind of happen, like serendipity. I feel like, my Reiki master teacher that I studied under to become a Reiki master teacher would always have her phrase, all is in divine order. Mm-hmm. And I, to a large degree, feel that's true. And I think things just sort of happen. And so, it's like a friend of ours posted some meme on Facebook, which, the good, the bad, the ugly, the memes of Facebook. It had something to do about like privilege. And if you get to a point where you have a loving spouse and you can have a happy holidays and you're in your own home, congratulations, you've made it. But, he responded to our friend with something I agree with, which is, a lot of sometimes it's good luck and circumstance along with it. So, it's interesting because privilege pays into it. I don't have, for example, heterosexual privilege. I'm as gay as the summer solstice day is long. Wouldn't change it. But I do have white privilege. I do have male privilege. I do have cisgender privilege. You know, I identify as male. I was born as male. That makes things a hell of a lot easier for me. But there's other things I don't like. I have spirituality that there are still people in this world think we're sacrificing babies. It's not the case. They're far too rubbery anyway. No, just kidding. No. There's a whole joke. I have a friend that she gets so frustrated with that, and she'll chant, "I love children, yes I do, in a super, in a stew." And it's like, no, just kidding, just kidding. It's interesting that there are various things that we all have or don't have privilege for. And I have people in my life that will get up in arms and say, well, I don't have privilege because, and the thing that they say after because is a true reason that they don't have a certain type of privilege. But then they do have this other type that they ignore with total blinders because these others. And so it's like, yeah, we're still fighting for, queer rights in this country. Sure, marriage was not the end of it, trust me. There's multiple reasons that a lot of people are nervous right now with various Supreme Court decisions and what they could snowball into. So there's political implications there. But if we all recognize where we do and don't have privilege, I think that we can see where we can work with each other.
Ferdy, it says, understanding what is and isn't privilege and which we do and do not benefit is vital in walking modern spiritual paths.
Oh, I agree. And, I definitely think it's true in Druidry. It's part of what we do. And I've done a lot of examining, where I do and don't have privilege. And I'm not perfect at it. And I don't expect anyone to be. I think we all slip up. And there's moments where we benefit from a privilege and we don't always know it, or somebody points it out, we get a little defensive. And I think that initial defensiveness is quite okay. That's natural. As long as we can stop and listen, and at the end, we still may not agree that we have the privilege we were accused of having. And we may or may not be right in our agreement or disagreement. But I think we start to win when we ourselves stop to listen. If you can at least hear what the other person is saying. They could be totally wrong. Whatever it is, whether it's them accusing you of a privilege, or they have a different opinion of yours, or they're stating the sky is neon orange when really it's blue. If you listen, you don't have to agree, but you've got to listen, at least if they're not being abusive in any way. So someone's you don't have to listen to anyone who's being abusive, but one also has to draw the line between hearing somebody that's impassioned, and both parties have to listen. Let them say what they need to say, as long as they stop to listen, let you reply. Because sometimes we get so impassioned that we don't let the other person reply.
That's true.
And sometimes when you explain yourself and you don't pause, you're missing them saying, wow, I never thought of it that way. I can kind of see your point. I'm starting to understand. Because we can, people, goodness knows I've changed thoughts and opinions over the years. Like I mentioned earlier about how the whole thing where, when I left the South, I did not have a lot of fondness for anything, right? And now looking back, I'm like, okay, well, let's try to sort this a little more, And people change, and we have to allow that, That's also why, like, a huge soapbox I'll get on is I believe in restorative justice over punitive justice. And, this can go many directions, but when somebody messes up, let's even like justice on a hyper local. Let's not even talk about a jailable offense. Let's just talk about somebody commits an offense against you. You know, if they acknowledge that, they apologize, and there's a discussion, and we lay out how to move forward, you know, how we're going to address this when it comes up next time differently. You know, let that person redeem themselves. You know, like a person, I also like to say all the time, nobody is all one thing.
Yep.
You know, so people make mistakes. Now, when offenses start to stack and we've had conversations and we identify ways to do things differently and what intentions were and were not, and these things keep occurring despite that, well, then you have to assess things with a person. But my goodness, you know, I've certainly done things that as younger me that I'm like, oh, I'm so glad people, you know, let me grow and change.
That's right.
Yeah.
Gabrielle has an interesting way to think about this. I think the word privilege leads to guilt and shame. I prefer responsibility, which leads to duty and honorable actions.
The reason why I don't want to change that, I don't think responsibility and privilege are necessarily the same, is responsibility is something you do carry upon yourself. Like you have a responsibility to others and you uphold it within yourself as ethics and morals. Privilege is often granted upon you. Mm-hmm. So like, even if it's just by chance, people say, well, you know, being white wasn't granted upon me. I was just born that way. But genetics granted that upon you, and society then grants you certain things because of it. So, you know, I do see where people shirk at the word privilege, but I think that I'm also big on the reclamation of terms, whether they're identity labels or other terms. So privilege is a neutral. In reality, it's not a negative thing that, for example, inherently that I am white. It's what I do with it, right? So privilege, you have a responsibility because of your privilege, but I have a hard time equating them to the exact same thing. Like economic status grants a privilege, right? I then have responsibilities to society because of that privilege. Mm-hmm. But I still feel it's a useful delineation. So I do agree there's a Venn diagram. So I don't completely disagree, but I think it's important to have both terms.
You know, Blake, we have gone way over our time.
Oh my.
The time has absolutely flown. We could give another conversation, a whole conversation to this topic. So I'm going to, we need to end, but it's been really, really interesting. What is your, okay, Gabriella says, in the past, kings and nobles always had responsibilities towards societies, and I feel that got lost. That's an interesting one.
It's a good point for thinking.
Anyway, we need to end, but we're going to end with my usual last question. What is your favorite season of the year, and which is your favorite ceremony marking the wheel of the year?
Top favorite, autumn. And the toss-up for the ritual is either Samhain or Albin Elfhead.
Sorry, Gabriella. Gabrielle always likes to bet, and she thought it would be Lunasa. Okay.
I'm a 3 seasons kind of guy, and summer isn't one of them. So.
Okay. Better luck next time, Gabriella. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I like all 4 seasons, but our summers here are not. They're not too hot, so
Yeah.
People can complain here because they're not hot enough. But anyway, listen, we have to end. We've gone over our 2-hour mark. It's been such a joy chatting to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for everybody that hung in there, you know.
We've got really, really loyal viewers here. And thank you for. So you hang on. I'm going to just say goodbye because you and I will go over them. Looking at the comments together.
Sure.
So I say you can say goodnight to everybody now, and I'll close the curtains.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining, and many blessings from the Merrimack Valley of New Hampshire. And I hope that everyone's winter solstice is wonderful and full of all the blessings of the season.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us again for another Fireside Chat, and thank you for your comments. And I know we didn't get to, we never do, to get to deal with all of them, but Blake and I will go over them. So wishing you the rest of your day. It's nighttime here now, morning or afternoon. And I look forward to seeing you next week for another Fireside Chat. And in the meantime, be well and take care of yourselves. Slán go fóill.